Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us here. My name is Dr. DeMarzo. I'm the Curator of Education and Academic Engagement here at the Fairfield University Art Museum. It's my pleasure to welcome tonight's speaker, Dr. Viviana Bucarelli. For those of you who don't know, her talk this evening is being presented in conjunction with the exhibition for which it stands, which is on view in both of the museum's galleries through July of this year. And it will be open until 8 o'clock tonight, both in the Bellarmine Hall galleries downstairs and the Walsh Gallery that is in the Quick Center. So if you'd like to see the show after her talk, you will have ample time to do so. And if you'd like to catch up on some of the other events we've had related to this exhibition, you can visit our YouTube page and catch up on them there. Dr. Bucarelli's talk tonight is part of the Edwin R. Wiesl Lecture Series that is funded by the Robert Lehman Foundation. And we also want to give a special note of thanks to Dr. Eliasov, many of whom I know you are his students who are here tonight. He was also the person who suggested Dr. Bucarelli as tonight's speaker, so thank you to Dr. E. Dr. Viviana Bucarelli holds a PhD in art history from the Graduate Center of the City University of New York. Her research focuses on American art in the first half of the 20th century, as we are going to hear about tonight. And she is currently working on a book project related to her dissertation, the title of which is American Realists and Magic Realists, MoMA's 1943 Wartime Show, which analyzes that historic exhibition that was held at MoMA in 1943, as the title implies, at a moment that was particularly dramatic and turbulent, both in the United States and abroad. Dr. Bucarelli is adjunct assistant professor at Hunter College, where she teaches history of modern art as well as introduction to the history of art, and she's also a longtime contributor to the art newspaper. So please join me in thanking Dr. Viviana Bucarelli.
Thank you, and good afternoon, everyone. As we prepare to celebrate the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, I would like to invite you to join me on a brief journey through a selection of American artists who express with their works the quintessential American character and experience in the years before, during, and after the Second World War. This is a story of the search for an American artistic identity, an American artistic vocabulary. It is also a kind of a battle between the new and the American legacy and link to the European tradition. It is also kind of a battle between realism and abstraction, as we are going to see. These are subjects on which I have been interested for quite some time as a European since my undergraduate years. And I would like to start with you with the years before the war, and with the artist whom in his delightful book, Calvin Tompkins, book titled Living Well is the Best Revenge, describes as the man who didn't like just modern art, lived it, turning style, friendship, and pleasure into a kind of aesthetic practice. Gerald Murphy has been defined as the quintessential American expatriate and the epitome of the jazz age. With Sarah, they moved to France for 11, settled there for 11 years. And they split their time between Paris and Cap d'Antibes, where they befriended Pablo Picasso, but some of the most brilliant minds among the American expatriates, Dos Passos, Fitzgerald, Hemingway, and then also, besides Picasso, Léger, Stravinsky, Diaghilev, Jean Cocteau, Éric Satie, Tristan Tzara, Le Corbusier, who were all regulars at their house, while Man Ray took their family photographs. Murphy fell in love with the European avant-garde and the work of the Cubists, Picasso, Braque, Léger, Juan Gris, and also some of the Fauve and Matisse. But in his works, what the French praised and admired in him was kind of a freshness, an identity that was very specific, that they admired because they could single out American elements. And they praise him as they did other American geniuses of the time, such as Charlie Chaplin, whose work Murphy evokes in paintings such as Watch. They both, the French, European Cubists and avant-garde artists, were focused on the everyday, on objects that were part of the everyday surroundings, as Gerald Murphy was. But there was something different, an emphasis on modernity, technology, looking ahead, and optimism of the machine of the future. And that's exactly what the French, the Europeans needed in this moment when Europe was devastated by World War I. But there was more. In some of these works, such as Razor, they admired that these objects were immediately recognizable. They were very familiar, the razors, the matchboxes, the fountain pens, very popular both in Europe and in this country. And they were rendered with a style that was precise, sharply focused, with an emphasis on bold colors, on a language that evokes graphic design, industrial design. We have to say that Gerald Murphy came from a family of leather good business owners. He was obsessed with industrial design, with packaging, with presentation, even in his everyday life. This was the language that he looked at. But these works had even more. They had this object had very large proportions, as if they were very large close-ups. They evoked, for especially the French, the language of the billboards, of commercial advertising, and also of American movies. And they were also as familiar and comforting in a way, because of consumer goods, the same way in which in 40 years Andy Warhol's Campbell's canned soup will be. The Murphys really consciously promoted their American identity. They called this fabulous house that was a gathering place for all these brilliant minds, Villa America. And when Gerald painted a work dedicated to Villa America, emphasized the colors of the flag, which are, though, red, white, and blue, that are also the colors of the French flag, as if he wanted to emphasize his bi-coastal identity of an artist who had a soul split in two. And speaking of a soul that is in between two languages in a way, From Gerald Murphy, we're going to look at the work of his contemporary Stuart Davis, whose art and style is shaped by mainly two elements. The teachings of his favorite master and professor, Robert Henry, and who encouraged him to look around at his surroundings for inspiration, for subjects, to look for a subject that had to be American local, but also he combined, Davis, these teachings and in source of inspiration with what he was fascinated by, which was the Armory show, a transformative experience where for the first time the European avant-gardes were introduced to a New York audience. And so he creates this language with once again, bold colors, dynamic forms, flat shapes that reinvent the on-the-road spirit, the idea of a fast-paced traveling on the road, the ever-growing presence of a commercial culture on the road, and the roadscape elements in works such as this, and in other works in which other landscapes in which he is also inspired by the music that he loved the most, swing, blues, and jazz. In this regard, the critic Robert Hughes wrote beautifully about swing landscape, and I just want to share with you. He said, quote, "It is a riotous, almost chaotic freeze in which his passion for rendering visual analogs to jazz syncopation gets full play. It don't mean a thing if it ain't got that swing." He was fond of quoting from Duke Ellington. And here Davis signs for bridge, cable, girder, funnel, ladder, and buoy jive and flicker in a matrix of all-out color, dominated by cobalts and ultramarines, against which his lemon, yellows, and fuchsias pulse. And Davis was not an isolated figure in this moment in the mid-30s in supporting abstraction. Important new organizations were created, such as the AAA, the AAC, the second one to which he belonged. The first one instead founded by the students of Hans Hofmann, who we will see as considered in a way the founding fathers of abstract, the ABX, abstract expressionism, whereas the ACC was closely connected to the Communist Party because a group of artists saw communism in this moment an important tool to oppose the ever-growing and very concerning, rightly so, growth of fascism in Europe. But in this context, while abstraction developed, the popular tradition of and powerful tradition of American realism was thriving. As in the exhibition catalog of the historical show titled American Realist and Magic Realist, which MoMA organized in 1943, the director of the show, Dorothy Miller, wrote, quote, "Realism has always been strongly ingrained in the American tradition," end quote. And we can talk of many realisms the first of which was the realism of the Midwestern regionalist, such as John Stuart Carey, Thomas Hart Benton, and Grant Wood, a group of which Hughes said once was the first full-scale American art world hype. And about Wood, it is also very interesting that first and foremost, he goes abroad. He travels, he studies, and he spent time in Italy, then in Northern Europe, in Central Europe, and he falls in love with the Northern Renaissance artist, Memling in particular, because of the minutiae, because of the attention to detail, because of this sharp focus and precise representation that comes back often. He also falls in love with the his contemporary German magic realists. An oxymoron in itself, a movement, sort of a movement that has been very understudied, which is incredibly charming, and to which Grant Wood has been assimilated in some instances. Grant Wood comes back to his native Iowa, and he creates his style out of original, unique, out of all these interests that he has, including a special attention for materials, for manual work. He is fond of jewelry making, and many other things, such as traditional American folk art. But when he comes back to Iowa, he said that Iowa made him a painter, that he was first and foremost a farmer painter. And with some of his works, wins the largest, such as American Gothic, wins some of the most important prizes. He also represents crucial moments in the history of his country, in paintings such as Midnight Ride of Paul Revere, who becomes such an icon that is even the backdrop of a bar of a most beloved Greenwich Village bar and restaurant. Of the work of Grant Wood, it has been very nicely said that he painted his land, cultivated green and golden hills, the fruits of its earth, the land around his hometown, the nature around himself, the crispy, windy air and warm light of the countryside. But with most authoritative tone, Time magazine, right after these few years, actually, after this, the completion of this painting, crowns him as, quote, the chief philosopher and greatest teacher of representational U.S. art, saying that he captured the true spirit of the country and that he was acclaimed both by viewers and critics who perceived his art as quaint, humorous, and most of all, American. Speaking of realisms, we want at least mention social realism, American social realism, and its towering figure, Ben Shahn, who represents here the case of Nicola Sacco and Bartolomeo Vanzetti, for which he was outraged, as a lot of people around the world. He represents them here lying in their coffins after their death sentence, and behind them, the wealthy intellectual Massachusetts establishment hostile to their political ideals. Samuel Stratton, the president of MIT, Lawrence Lowell, Harvard's president, and Robert Grant, a retired judge, the 3 members of the review committee. But in the background, he also shows Webster Fair, the judge who sentenced them to death only after 10 days. In the detail, you can see the judge swearing in front of the fasces, which is the quintessential symbol of the judicial power, and which famously also is shown in the legendary Udon's Museum of George Washington. But with his subtle and deep and unique sense of humor, Ben Shun transforms the fasces into a lamppost, and also emphasizes for sure the fact that fasces is the word from which the word fascism comes from. And seems quickly, but speaking of this context, these years, and more realism, we have to spend a little time on a champion of American realism. We should say realism in the US, but that's a question, it's a discussion in itself. Edward Hopper. As Gail Levin argued in her seminal publication, An Intimate Biography, Hopper stands, quote, as the quintessential American realist. It has also been said that it's hard to think of another painter who is getting more of the quality of America, and that Hopper's images have become part of the very grain and texture of the American experience. It is true that they are ubiquitous. They have been for a couple of decades on book, magazine covers, laptops, in the shape that they are supposed to be on, in a very unorthodox form. But of Hopper, we want to start saying that also he was influenced, as Davis, by that great teacher, Robert Henry. He studied also with William Merritt Chase and Kenneth Hayes Miller, but Robert Henry was the most important influence and his most fundamental teacher from the beginning. And he always told his students that art, quote, is life, an expression of life, an expression of the artist and an interpretation of life, and encouraged them to find inspiration from their surroundings and focus on an American subject, but not before having traveled abroad, and especially go to Paris, where they could absorb as much life as possible. Go to cafes, go in the streets, look around. And Hopper looked around a lot. Besides visiting museums, so he looked at the architecture. He indulged in his favorite passions, photography, theater, movies. He often said that every now and then he went on a movie binge, both when in Paris and back in New York. And in Paris, he develops his great passion for architecture, which becomes one of his most important subjects. A couple of paintings that he completes in the 1920s are acquired by important museums. They establish his success. Both this painting was acquired by the Brooklyn Museum and this one by MoMA. Actually, House by the Railroad is the first major acquisition by MoMA period, which is incredibly interesting because Abby Rockefeller and the other founders of the museum had a mission for the museum that had to focus both on European, and in fact, the first shows at MoMA in 1929 are on European art and also on American art. But the first purchase is Hopper's House by the Railroad. And we have the first examples of buildings that with their towering presence seem like to speak by themselves. And this is incredibly interesting because it evokes an important tradition in American literature, from Emily Dickinson to Henry James, in which architectural metaphors stand for the mind and the human personality. Emily Dickinson writes, for example, the brain has corridors surpassing material place. Henry James in American Scene writes instead, quote, a building is not a mere edifice, it is a voice. And W.H. Auden, speaking of James' book, writes, outside of fairy tales, I know of no book in which things so often and naturally become persons. And when we look at some of Hopper's most iconic paintings, we can feel that, we can think that. Early Sunday Morning is just represents a quiet row of brownstones and stores with empty windows, no signs, a barber pole and a fire hydrant. But it is through the horizontal and verticals, these bold colors beautifully juxtaposed, that they evoke emotions. It is one of the paintings in Hopper's case that has been defined as magic realist, where the quotidian, the everyday, the normal becomes becomes extraordinary and becomes magical in a way, just because of the composition, the colors, the light, and the way in which it is represented with absolutely no figures. Hopper had initially thought about including one figure, and then he decided not to. Figures emerge in another his very iconic work, Nighthawks, but they're certainly secondary. It is more what rules in this painting is geometry, is light. It is all about this night diner and this corner with, in the background, the signature building that we just saw. And it's the light that brings to life this scene, which also is influenced by the language of the movies, French film noir, American gangster movies. It's influenced by literature and by the movie that was made based on Hemingway's The Killer, and also has very interesting connections with other works by Hopper, such as Night Shadow and Drugstore. But Hopper also evoke the American experience, the American character in his landscapes, such as Road in Maine, in which he seems to celebrate the beauty of and the mystery and the expectation around the corner of traveling. He loved to travel. They traveled with Joe, his wife, by car very often. He even wrote, "To me, the most important thing is the sense of going on. You know how beautiful things are when you are traveling." And also in later paintings, such as Route 6 Eastham, in which he places on the very foreground the road that seems to be painted from the perspective of the driver. He wrote again about capturing the look of the asphalt road, that it lies in the broiling sun at noon. Cars, the steaming summer rain, midsummer streets with the acid green of close-cut lawns, the dusty fords. He also paints the roadside landscape, celebrating in a way the ever-growing system of highways in the 1940s. This is when, on October 1st, 1940, the Pennsylvania Turnpike, later known as Interstate 76, was opened and became America's first superhighway. And then he represents the other iconic aspects of the roadside of the traveling, as if they were these paintings a visual diary on the tradition of the 18th and 19th century travelogue. And once again, when all this happens, we are in the middle of the war years, and on the other hand, on the side of abstraction, there is a group of artists who create a language, an artistic language style that could, for them, express, convey, and help them coping with the tragedy of the war. They called themselves, and were called, as always happens in artistic movement, the myth makers. They drew upon myths, Greco-Roman myths, Native American myths, what was called pre-Columbian myths. And this because they considered myths a universal language that speak of the human condition and could, because of its universality, help recreate a sense of wholeness of a world that was devastated by the war. The fact that they were inspired, they used Native American and pre-Columbian myths, created a new American identity that mirrored the contemporary Pan-American politics and cultural politics which reached its highest point in 1942, which is defined by historians as the most romantic moment in the history of intercontinental relationships. It is a language that expresses this moment. It is also an art that reflects the cultural politics of institutions such as MoMA that in between 1940 and 1943 includes in their exhibition program shows of Native American artists, Latin American artists, pre-Columbian, and what they call inter-American artists. And these are the years of the war. The war that Winston Churchill defined as a conflict of unparalleled scope and consequence, emphasizes that never has there been a war in which so many nations were engaged over so vast an area and with such terrible consequences. A war that altered the course of the 20th century. Politically, a reconfigured map emerged from the ruins. The systematic murder of the European Jews and the use of the atomic bomb revealed the use of weapons that had not a historical precedent. So art could not be the same, as the world was not the same. And as Theodor Adorno wrote, to write poetry after Auschwitz is barbarism. So we have to expect radical revolutionary changes, which happen also in the art establishment and in the system of power, also for what concerns the world art centers. New York becomes Paris in this moment, what Paris had been for 200 years. The most influential theory of in literary and philosophical theory is existentialism, which fills that gap of alienation, a sense of loss left by the war. And in painting, artists embrace total abstraction. An abstraction that they say is never subjectless. It is actually capable of expressing the deepest emotion, all the varied aspects of the psyche, could actually maybe give some explanation of the horror of the war. As Barnett Newman recalled, looking back at the 1940s, at his generation, we felt the moral crisis of a world in shambles, a world devastated by a Great Depression and a fierce world war. It was impossible at the time to paint the kind of paintings that we were doing. Flowers, reclining nudes, and people playing cello. This was our moral crisis in relation to what to paint. And so, most of these artists who were the myth makers become the abstract expressionists. Barnett Newman, Mark Rothko, Jackson Pollock, and others. The term is used for the very first time in 1946 by Robert Coates to define the work of Hans Hofmann, Effervescence. As we said, the artist who is considered like the father of the generation of the abstract expressionists. What is abstract expressionism mainly based on? scale. These are paintings that are supposed to envelope, completely wrap, and immediately engage the viewer. Rothko specifically says that she wants the viewer be as close as possible to the painting to feel completely wrapped and involved by it. So it is also about a direct experience with a painting with no filter, just the color and shape and all the emotion that can immediately come from them. Well, the superstar, though, of the group is certainly one, Jackson Pollock, of whom Leo Steinberg famously says, "How good these pictures are, I cannot tell, but know that they have something of the barbarism of an ancient epic. Does anybody ask why the Song of Gilgamesh is any good?" These are the paintings that he is talking about in the mid-40s. Even though behind the creation of the movement of abstract expressionism and behind the superstardom of Pollock, there is mainly another critic, Clement Greenberg, who defines Pollock as the strongest painter of his generation, and perhaps the greatest one to appear since Miro, and the greatest painter this country has ever produced. And Peter Plagens interjected, greater than Thomas Cole, greater than Thomas Atkins, greater than Stuart Davis, greater than Edward Hopper, and this was way before the inaugural Pollock drip had hit the canvas. Pollock indeed hit the canvas with his drip at a certain point. And he created these other magnificent works that, as William Agee used to say, are environment. It feels like a morning, a sunny morning in springtime. These are paintings in which you perceive the third dimension, you perceive space, because you feel like this physicality of the artist who is walking and jumping around this canvas that is on the floor. But you even can perceive at a certain point the fourth dimension, the time, the sense of time of this work, for how long he moved around and how long it took to create this painting. It's another word. In the issue of August 8, 1949, Life magazine features a story on Jackson Pollock in which asks a rhetorical question that is indeed crowning him as the greatest living painter in the United States. So also, just to wrap this up, abstract expressionism starting around this time, the 1950, and in the early 1950, becomes the iconic symbol of freedom, of the representation, expression of an inner life, an inner freedom of the artist who could only do this in a democratic society. It is the art that is the embodiment of a free nation, of democratic values, opposed to the government-mandated social realism of the Soviet Union. The abstract expressionists find themselves entangled with the Cold War politics There is a debate on the extent of covert government support, particularly through the CIA. And some historians argue that promoting abstract expressionism abroad served as a form of cultural diplomacy. Historian David Anthem wrote that it was the best thing that an institution could pay for, saying, quote, "I much rather prefer that they spent money on abstract expressionism than toppling left-wing dictators," end quote. And I would like to add, of any dictator, of any kind, and I couldn't agree more. Thank you.